Behold, my glorious supporter Quartermaster Sea has requested some more design space for Warframe concepts, frame themes, potential frame ideas that I feel like aren't in the game, or just I'd like more of them or them done in a different way. Quartermaster Sea asks, what are some potential themes you'd like to see future Warframes designed around? For example, some people have asked about a possible grappler frame. If you'd like, you could also include ideas for an ability to illustrate each frame. Cool. So what I've done is listed out 5 things that I feel like are design space I'd like to see more of or used, but I've put them kind of in descending order of how likely I think they are to be in the game and how good of an idea I think they are. I'm going to explain that as we go, but some of these I don't think are as good ideas as others. Maybe because I don't think it's likely the developers will actually make them. And others of them, I don't think it's a great idea because I think I want this because it's part of a larger problem. And I don't think making a Warframe to address that problem is actually the best solution. It's just what I think we would actually get. So I'll explain that as we go, but that's what I mean by, worse. I want all of them ideally, or I want to feel like that design space is used, but this might not be the way to do it. So we'll start with the best ones, and then we'll go from there. They're not the best ones, but the ones Spider frame. Let's just begin. With venom and webs and such. So this is in between sort of your Korra and your Saren. And the reason for this, you might be thinking, this is really the one you have the most confidence in. The reason is that Saren and Korra are both examples of Warframes that they're casting a rather wide net on the design space that they're touching. So Korra is sort of your BDSM, whips and chains, and kind of Beastmaster, and also kind of spider and loot thing. She's doing a lot of things. I don't think that's bad. I think this is different from frames like Titania that I feel like are stretching a certain design space very thin. A couple of Titania's abilities are kind of very similar in how you might use them. They are different, but they feel like they overlap. Having a frame have both of them doesn't seem that useful. And then Tribute getting the buffs, that feels a little overwrought. There's a lot of detail in that ability that feels like you could spread that out over more of a Warframe's kit, and it's a cool idea. I kind of like that ability, but I just don't think this is the best way you could do it. And then Razorwing is also a huge ability with multiple exalted weapons, and she's just a Warframe that's using a lot of design space that could be spread out over multiple frames. And with Korra and Saren, it's kind of a similar problem, but kind of a different problem where they're kind of different ideas that actually aren't taken that far. Korra with the whip thing, you don't really feel like you're using whips and chains. I guess you do, but that much, it's kind of a basic implementation of that. Grouping enemies together, kind of swinging them around is something I'd be interested in. That's not really in the kit. The Beastmaster thing is kind of half touched on, almost barely touched on by Korra, and a little bit with frames like Oberon. It's not explored as much as I'd like. I'd rather that was just a different frame, and then we focus more on this whips and chains thing. Likewise with Saren, there are Warframes, Ember, Frost, that are one element, and Saren is kind of barely touching the design space for 3 elements: toxin, corrosive, and viral. And I think there's a lot more you could do with those elements. I think if we want to do it in that kind of spread out way, that's fine. And I think on balance, it's good for a sort of venom or poison or both kind of frame, because you kind of want a lot of different kinds of poison. I think that's interesting. A little bit, Lavos is doing something similar to that with like a lot of different types of ailments, and we'll get back to that later. But that's why I want that. It might seem similar to Korra and Saren, but I think there's a lot of room to make a Warframe that can climb on walls. They can wall latch and then move. This is something I heard suggested for Loki. You may not be aware because it's usually not relevant, but Loki's passive is that he can wall latch for much, much longer. Now, of course, that is completely useless. There's really no, I actually made a meme video where I showed you can mod it. This was like 4 years ago or something, and wall latch for like 3 minutes straight or something, which is never ever useful. You essentially never want to do that. Again, if you hold me at 25 gun points, then I'm sure I can come up with some reason why you would want to do that. I don't know. But anyway, you get the point. No, let's just give Loki a new passive. Passives were always, and really a topic for another time, but were always something that was hastily implemented, and a lot of them are just totally half-baked. We shouldn't try to embrace them. We should just make a new one. We should just make a proper one. And this spider Warframe is obviously the Warframe that should have the crawling on walls somehow passive. Maybe also stealthed while being on a wall or something like that. A version of Wisp's passive where you're stealthed in the air, something like that maybe. When you're touching a surface but it's not the ground, you're stealthed, something to that effect. And then you can also wall latch and move, or maybe dash or wall run, you know, in more directions or faster. I don't know how it would work, but that's totally a thing you could do. And then webs, zone control, basically, being able to sort of yoink enemies up. I like the idea of that stereotypical little rope trap where you step in it and it nooses your feet and then you go whoop and, you know, fly up into the air. That sounds like something that would be fun if it affected an area. I'm thinking this will mechanically maybe be a little similar to Korra's ensnare thingy, but for this spider Warframe, this is going to be more of a basic ability rather than her fourth ability, Korra's really big ability, where you make this cage thing and the enemies fly around like that. Also less messy. Maybe a way to set them up for some kind of poison chain reaction kind of thing. I don't know why, but in video games it feels like poison has this trope of being explosive or something. I also think it'd be cool if Spiderframe here had this idea of defensive toxins, where if you hit them, they have like a more meaningful version of Frost's passive, where you get hit and then enemies have like a meaningless chance to get frozen, and like you don't actually want to get hit in melee range anyway. Maybe this Warframe, whenever they're hit, maybe not even just with a melee weapon, like ranged weapons, you sort of fire out these little poison darts to retaliate. And it's like when poison, you know, animals in real life have this coloration. Ooh, designing this Warframe from an artistic perspective, that sounds cool. Nice, right? So I know you didn't ask for, you know, this in-depth a discussion of, you know, you were saying maybe an ability to illustrate the idea. I'm more talking about what, when I say a spider Warframe, what do I mean by the design space for that? And really what I mean is controlling enemies in space and having the ability to inflict a variety of different poisons on them. But this is something that the Warframe is doing as more of a zone control thing. Saren is much more of a sprawling kind of elemental brawler Warframe, adding effects on to your own damage while staying mobile. This is going to be kind of the opposite, more like Korra's design space, being able to control space, maybe group enemies together in some way, but focusing more on toxins and directly doing damage with status effects and fleshing out the design space of toxin and corrosive and viral a little more. I think that this is a good Warframe to make Viral do some damage itself. I know, suggesting that Viral would have even more powerful effects, ridiculous, but maybe this Warframe can have an effect that causes stacks of Viral to actually do damage to the frame and add that design space of being really deeply infected. That could be really bad, or enemies that like touch each other or something spread the stack of Viral, something to that effect. When an enemy in your web has a status effect that is toxin, corrosive, or viral, or maybe even gas, that automatically spreads to any other webbed enemy, something like that. That's good. There we go. So something that kind of, I don't know how that works from a flavor perspective, but that just kind of links all the enemies. There are a number of effects in Warframe, not a ton, but that kind of spread status effects under some circumstances. And I think that idea is really cool, and a lot of those effects are not quite there. I feel like what would help is if you had more control over them, if they activated more directly, and if they were less based on just radius and more like you fill certain conditions and then the effects spread, if that makes sense. So that's my spider Warframe concept. Now, you might be thinking there are 5 like this. No, there aren't. That's the point. I like that. That sounds interesting. I feel like it adds to some space that I feel like isn't being used, but sounds really cool. I think spiders as a concept are pretty easy to do for a Space Ninja game. When I say easy, I just mean there is a lot of design space. There's a lot of things that ninjas do that spiders do. There's a lot of overlap with crawling and being stealthy and poisons and stuff. It feels like a ninja-y topic. Ash even kind of looks like a spider, you know? So anyway, that. Let's move on. So that's the spider frame. Next one is kind of a a life or a holy or blessing themed frame, maybe just a more aggressive version of a monk than Baruch. This is a little bit like Trinity, but Trinity to me is more of an energy based or kind of technical feeling frame. This is going to be more of a your light luminescence kind of themed frame. Also, Mirage, as a lot of you know, I think does this, kind of has this theme, but does it very, very badly. Or the developers just seem decisively to not want to do any more with that. That really frustrates me, but what are you going to do? Yeah, so some sort of, and maybe even fire, but just focused on the luminescence. I'm not sure exactly what that would do from an overall design perspective, but one idea I had was utilizing status effects, which really are a focus of Warframe, but which I feel like people don't understand to be the focus of the game that they are. They objectively are. It's not a matter of whether you prefer them or not. They are a core aspect of the game's combat, but I think a lot of people bounce off them because they feel extra. They feel like an extra thing rather than a core aspect of combat. And having more Warframes that more and more, we've been getting more Lavos that kind of specialize in status effects, I think is really good. And it means that if they want to take the game in a direction where everything isn't about status effects all the time, that design space is available. But increasingly, Warframes will assume that you are using status effects because that is a logical assumption. That is how the game is designed at the moment. And yet it leaves room for it to be different as well. So blah, 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 blah. My idea is that this Warframe can kind of purify status effects off of enemies to get a big damage boost. Now, this is not the same as something like Condition Overload or your Lavos's the fourth ability, Catalyze, that I forgot the name of for a sec. This is more about maybe when you use the ability, the enemy itself that you targeted is safe, but nearby enemies take a ton of damage and nearby allies heal a lot of health. That enemy is just sort of consecrated. The idea for this for me came from kind of a reverse version of Trinity's Well of Life. Like, I was thinking about, why is that ability bad? And it's because it's very passive. You do it and it just doesn't do much, and it doesn't reward you for doing much. It just is a relatively non-impactful ability, and it also makes you pay a cost. It makes you pay the cost of an enemy not immediately dying. Doesn't always matter, but it is usually not an advantage, you know. So what if that was a cost? What would make that cost feel worth it? You make one enemy just not die. Maybe they even can't die for a little while and can continue attacking. Or maybe it's not as much a trade-off and they're turned to your side, like a more powerful version of mind control. They get cleansed violently, kill enemies around them in all likelihood, and heal allies, hopefully you, while also temporarily coming to your side before they just die eventually. But the setup is you need a lot of, and this is key, different kinds of status effects on them. Maybe not a lot of one stack, so it's rewarding you for having a variety. A lot of people seem to be interested in this sort of dirty bombing playstyle, where you add a lot of different status effects to enemies. It looks cool. It's kind of embracing that idea of the big number thing. You know, it's a big number, it's big overkill damage, that's completely useless, but people like seeing big number. I mean, I don't, but a lot of people do. And this kind of embraces that. You want to see all those different effects going off, but it's not really good for everything that cares about the effect. Only a few is enough to just heinously overkill the enemy. So what about an effect that really pays you for that? Maybe every status effect, every unique status effect increases the range and the damage and healing and such. Maybe increases the duration of the enemy, you know, being on your side and fighting for you, and maybe it gives them attack speed, or they get movement speed, stuff like that. They get animation speed overall. This is something that could get really powerful if you made the sacrifice of building weapons in a particular way, and should be good if you build your weapons in a logical way. You could use a weapon that just has a normal slash and viral build or whatever, but it has innate radiation, and then that weapon is considerably better with that Warframe. Maybe the Warframe's signature weapon will have, it'll be magnetic and corrosive innately or something, but then have kind of somewhat lower crit chance to compensate. So it's really good at doing many different status effects, but corrosive and magnetic on a weapon innately is pretty broken. And so having it be, it doesn't crank out quite as much overall damage. It just has like a weaker critical multiplier as the way to do this. You give the weapon 15% crit chance and a 1.7 critical multiplier. And then it's still viable. It still has the multipliers that make things actually work in Warframe. And it's not a weapon where they just dump base damage on it and teach people that multipliers don't matter and it's all about dumping damage on things. Yet it is a weapon that is that little bit weaker in exchange for its very favorable type matchup against like every enemy that matters at that point. If it is corrosive, magnetic, and then you imagine you add toxin or just viral or gas, then the weapon is just cracked, but you make the damage a little bit more under control to compensate. And then that could be the Warframe signature weapon. And then maybe when they use the weapon, it even gets like one other random status effect or something when you shoot enemies, which gives a little bit of variety. Yeah, then people experiment with it a little more, but it's not actually that much more powerful. It does that thing with the signature weapons where it's a relevant benefit. You notice if you use it on the Warframe, but and because the Warframe cares about purifying many status effects, there's that whole thing. But you're not torn about whether you'd use the weapon on another Warframe. It's obviously good if it's good. The things that make the weapon functional at its core are not changed, and the signature effect doesn't add to that. It just means if you use it on this frame, there is a relevant increase in its effectiveness. I've mentioned before, just as a brief aside, that I actually really like the signature weapons. I think that they invite players to think that using a specific weapon with a specific frame is good without preventing players from choosing things on their own. Almost none of the effects are so valuable that there is actually a super important reason to use them on that Warframe. And furthermore, frames don't have 3 signature weapons, and we have a loadout with 3, 4 if you count heavy weapons. In missions with Necromechs and Archwing, we have like 7 weapons. So you really don't need to not have signature weapons to have room for choice on a Warframe. And so I think we might as well just have both. Have weapons that do synergize organically, that's just going to happen, and still have signature weapons to kind of invite players into that. So that's my sort of holy or kind of purification frame. I don't know exactly how this will work, but something like that. I do also like the idea of this frame having, if I had to say an element this frame might have, maybe radiation, an ability to really furiously irradiate enemies. An ability that I like on this Warframe, and this is going to make people sad because it's destroying Loki even more. Just literally irradiating disarm. Disarming and radiation sound like good, it turns off Eximus auras, enemies kind of drop their weapons because they're in awe of the light or whatever. I don't know, that stereotype. And Loki just has no design space right now. Again, a topic for another time, but I think the game would be better off if we put that on a Warframe that has this interesting thing going on rather than leaving it, or we could just make it the same ability. That's sort of okay. I would be sort of interested in Warframes, just broadly, having abilities that are in common with other Warframes very occasionally when it's appropriate, and then it kind of draws attention to the idea that the Warframe it's like this Warframe, but just complete focused on something totally different. Like the Warframe is, yes, irradiating disarm, and some people will just be stupid and say, oh, it's just that, but better. But they're completely different. This is a Warframe that is focused on, these status effect combos, and then is kind of a healer as well, whereas Loki couldn't be more different. It is a stealth Warframe, has some positioning stuff, the whole trickster thing. Now, again, Loki needs way more design space, so this is currently a bad example, but I wouldn't be opposed to that concept. I don't think they'll do that. And speaking of things that they won't do, let's get into the final 3. So those are 2 that I'm pretty interested in, or at least that design space I'm quite interested in. So a couple more things, just a little laundry list of they could do this with a frame and I think that would be cool, or they almost did this with a frame but I want more. A frame that does something more unique with loot. So Mirage has Explosive Ledger Main, which is cool, it's good in the right situation, creates mines based on, ammo packs and stuff on the ground. The problem with this for me is just it's pretty boring. It doesn't really make you feel like the loot is anything more than you just kind of do it. Like, it could just be enemy corpses and it really wouldn't be that different. That's what I'm talking about, basically. I kind of want a sort of you snowball all the loot out like a junk frame. That's really what I'm trying to get at. I didn't write that in my notes. I thought that just now. That's what I'm trying to say. A kind of junk based Warframe that maybe snowballs snowball me, snowball based gameplay where you can somehow hold loot temporarily, or there'll be some kind of thing where when you vacuum up loot, or you have a better vacuum ability that gets you more loot, one or the other, I'm not sure. If it's when you vacuum loot, it could have synergy with Mag's greedy pull, and then also you want to vacuum. Encouraging players to have a vacuum is good. Yeah, and then it's like when you vacuum up loot, it stays somewhere, or you make a copy of it somewhere, and then not only can you barf it back out, giving your allies another copy of the loot, or maybe you another copy of the loot, you sort of fabricate another copy of it. It also does damage. It's just a bunch of, imagine shotgun pellets. It's like a shotgun, basically. Yeah, maybe they have an exalted shotgun and the ammo is loot, something like that. Anyway, so that's the thing I think is interesting. You'll note that it is kind of done. We do sort of have that. Again, frames like Mirage. Lavos kind of a little bit modifies loot. I don't think you'd want this all over the place. I don't think those are bad things, by the way. I think Lavos has a good, moderate sub-theme with loot. That's fine. That's a nice way to think about transmuting as a theme for our Alchemist Warframe. That's cool. I do think having one frame that had that as a design space is good. However, I do feel like before, or maybe while we get something like that, I want a rework of the relationship between loot warframes and the rest of the game, or sources of more loot. Chesa Kubro could maybe get buffed finally to be even remotely interesting, because it just doesn't happen often enough normally. Maybe a Smedekavat rework of some sort. Maybe it could be a little more consistent and be a little less powerful, just to make the variance less insane. It's just kind of obnoxious to some types of players, maybe just to me. I know some people really like that. I really don't. I feel like it's frustrating because it potentially spits on your time. If you play for, 15 minutes and you just never get the loot buff, there's a huge difference between that and when you do get the loot buff. Suddenly you get an avalanche of the thing that you were trying to farm, and you don't really know whether that's going to happen. That's just frustrating, and I feel like there's no need. It can be random. If the buffs are just a little bit less insane, like you red crit with everything, but it's only, an orange crit and a half, 150% instead of 200, but then the charm buffs just happen more often. I don't really see how that's a loss for anyone. Like, you just get them more overall. It would be a better ability overall. It would be more consistent, but still have all of the flavor of being kind of random. It would make it way less likely that you'd play for like 15, 30 minutes and just never get this Smita buff. The loot doubling thing is what I mean. Or any other one you were looking for. I just think that's better for everyone. And you can disagree, but that kind of thing, I just feel like the place where getting more loot in Warframe is at the moment is really weird. I feel like doubling up on loot abilities should feel cool or sensible, but it doesn't, because so many of them are so awkward except for Desecrate and anyway, whatever. So there's that whole, like, just loot rework, the relationship that frames that do things to loot have to that loot. I do also think that while I like Lavos' Transmutation Probe and Mirage's Explosive Ledgermane, I do actually think they should be buffed in some way. I'm just not sure how, or maybe they have a more interesting relationship with... so one thing I mentioned was Lavos makes ammo into universal ammo. A lot of the time, ammo is just irrelevant in Warframe. So I think that his ammo packs should be able to increase your ammo efficiency in some way. You might be asking why that matters. It makes you reload less, which does make you do significantly more damage in a way many players don't acknowledge. Maybe they would if it was more of a thing in the game that a Warframe did rather than just some secondary effect. So I think that's interesting. Explosive Ledgermane, I don't know exactly. Guaranteed status effects, maybe. Something like that. Infinite duration in the mines, but then it'll lag your computer. Anyway, whatever, that. Kind of a similar thing, where it's kind of like how I feel about a game system overall, but I would be interested in a Warframe addressing this. A frame with a unique relationship to the Helminth system. We have Zaku. Zaku is a little bit doing this thing. It doesn't. They don't have a unique relationship with the helmet system, but you can see how they could and they should. That should just be what their passive is. That they can infuse two abilities with the helmet system or something. And now I think why this won't happen is that it makes the Warframe feel like their own abilities are just meaningless because half of their kit is going to get carved out for this thing. I don't know. I think there's a way to do this. Maybe you can make it be two abilities or three abilities in one slot somehow, and you can switch between them because the helmet abilities have been, at least I think all of them, have been kind of painstakingly ensured to not take. There are some you need to hold. Anyway, it feels like there's some way to do that, and I think people want that, or maybe just a Warframe with a lot of passives, and then you literally just infuse helmet abilities on them. It feels like that would take very little relative effort to put into the game, and it would be pretty cool without being overpowered, or maybe it would be overpowered. I don't know. This is a topic that I would like to see tackled, but I'm not sure. It does also have the problem that unlocking a lot of the helmet system takes a while. You know, it doesn't feel like it to some of us. We have it, but it does. It takes a lot of your time playing. And so maybe it would feel too exclusive. It would just be irrelevant to the people that maybe you just get a Warframe with the helmet system when you max it out or something. Yeah, you get every helmet ability in the helmet, or a certain threshold. You get 20 of them or something, or you rank it all the way up to 10, and then you get a Warframe that can just have any abilities. I don't know. That it might be too good, but I sort of feel like it wouldn't be. I feel like it would be a super hardcore utility Warframe, but it wouldn't really be overpowered. There would still be lots of reasons to use other frames, but maybe it wouldn't. Anyway. Finally, we have the worst idea, because I don't think this should really be solved by a Warframe, but I do think it'd be interesting, which is a heavy weapon specialist Warframe. We kind of have Warframes that are melee specialists, a little or a lot, and there are Warframes that are gun specialists, or at least a little. They kind of lean in that direction. And I think that having a Warframe that is a heavy weapon specialist in some way would be really cool. Now, what I want is this thing from World of Warcraft where warriors could get a talent where they dual wielded two-handed weapons. You could dual wield two-handed weapons. It looked badass. And I want that with two heavy weapons, and you can go da 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 da, and they're like all basically Gatling guns. So I think that would be cool. But I don't know. Anyway, I don't really know anything about that one, but my main point is that I think heavy weapons just don't have the design, or it's not that they don't have the design space. Heavy weapon mods have some ideas in them, sort of a utility or standing your ground kind of feeling to them. There is some, they're defined by having way less multi-shot than other categories of weapons. That's a big difference. Their vanilla elements are a lot stronger. That, again, these are small differences, but there's something. Then they have a lot of utility mods. When you're aiming down sights, you can't be staggered. The whole thing about them having a base damage mod that incorporates punch through nicely, a little bit reminiscent of how primary weapons have prime tread, fire rate, and punch through, which makes it easier to include those things as potential multipliers. There's some design space there, but a lot of heavy weapons are just very similar to each other. And the other thing is that for the cost of deploying them, if they're going to keep that heavy animation where you take your heavy weapon out, they've got to be better, because that long animation is a disadvantage. I think it's much better for that animation to still happen, but just faster, and it doesn't require you to stand still. You just do it on the go, and the animation of drawing your heavy weapon, that's slower, but not actually different than normal holster speed, and then you could mod it with holster speed. That'd be a good place for that. Just adding weapon X-list would add a good amount to heavy weapons, and then the final piece is they would just have to design more different heavy weapons. So you can see how even if you want a heavy weapon specialist Warframe, you would want a lot of changes to heavy weapons as well, at minimum, and maybe only. Maybe we don't need the heavy weapon specialist, we just need those changes to heavy weapons. But still something I thought of. Your grappler frame example made me think of that a little bit. But yeah, Anyway, that's what I got. I think there is a lot of design space for Warframes. I don't think that there's any concern with running out of design space. I don't think they're going to have trouble thinking of more new ideas. I don't think it. If you look at the Warframes we've gotten, I don't think they have had trouble coming up with pretty unique ideas. I feel like there has been a little power creep maybe, but I feel like they have come up with pretty fresh, pretty different ideas from most of the cast. There haven't been a lot of Warframes that feel like this Warframe is just derivative of this other Warframe, or this other Warframe is an incomplete version of this new Warframe. I don't think that's happened that much. You could disagree. To close out, I do think it would be interesting to embrace leaving slots in your loadout open more often. I'm thinking of this because of that grappler thing you mentioned, Quartermaster Sea. I'm thinking of this because of heavy weapons. Xenogelion. Goodness, Xeno. Mispronouncing your name after all this time. Xeno and I talked one time about this idea that heavy weapons were originally, maybe at an early point in development, our developers talked to us about the idea that you'd pick a primary or a secondary and a secondary, or a heavy weapon. And I thought that was a pretty cool idea because it meant your heavy weapon could be more powerful because there's an opportunity cost to equipping it. But they chose not to go in that direction. I think that was a huge mistake. I think you could do good things with the heavy weapon the way they've implemented it now, but I don't really feel they have been. I feel like it's a really wasted opportunity among many others in Warframe. My biggest complaint about Warframe is I think it's just full of missed gameplay mechanic opportunities because the game is way too focused on looking cool. But I don't think that's a bad focus. It just has its drawbacks, and I think that's one of them. So a Warframe that does something more with having a slot empty. Mesa gets more health, but it's a meaningless amount. You gain way more by just equipping a melee weapon. But a Warframe that equips no melee weapon and then just punches unarmed, and it has some different relationship with modding, or something, you like don't mod it, something like that. I'm not sure how that would work, but that idea sounds kind of cool to me. This is a total meme, but I actually think potentially a really interesting idea. I'm just not sure what you do. A Warframe that you don't equip guns and then you get literally finger pistols or something like it, and it somehow has, I don't know, they like fire things out of their. I don't know how this would work. I think that sounds kind of cool. Has a different relationship to dual wielding pistols versus a single pistol. I don't know. But anyway, I hope you had fun with my ideas for this. It wasn't very hard to come up with. I think a lot of things that it would be at least interesting to see them touch upon, let alone make a whole spider Warframe about. Come on, a little spooder. Give me the spooder Warframe. A little spood.